we're talking draft the next two segments with these two great gentlemen, as we've got Ben Brown, who does amazing work over at Pro Football Focus. We've got Matt Landis, who does an incredible job over at the Props and Hops podcast. Gentlemen, it is great to have you aboard. And Matt, I want to lead off with you because I know that you were talking a little bit off air because we've been talking about the draft for a very long time, but the way that we're able to talk about it now is just so much different than even a few weeks ago because there's new markets that are popping up. What have you been taking a look at in terms of the newer markets that have been popping up in recent weeks? Because the menu just keeps on expanding more and more, and the closer you get to the draft, the more options you have to bet it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things I've been looking to do is to see where we can expand our attack surface as bettors as the draft gets closer to us. Because for a while now, we've seen some over-unders on where players will be taken or first player to be taken at a certain position. Markets like that have gotten pretty mature, but let's look at tight end, for example. Michael Mayer has taken some steam recently, and in a market like that, Mayer to be taken as the first tight end overall or his position to the under has been beaten up pretty well. But just looking at different books, there's a prop that I was able to find JSN first wide receiver and Mayer first tight end off the board at plus 225. And just doing a bit of basic math here, the break-even probability of that plus 225, 31%. Now, I looked at these odds individually at sharper books, and it looks like the true probability is a bit north of 40%. So even once we factor in some VIG in a market like this, there's a bit of a cushion there. And I bring this up not thinking that this JSN and Mayer parlay is widely available at the moment, but it's something worth keeping an eye out for at a lot of different books that will populate their draft boards much more heavily in the coming days, because while this specific bet might not be widely available, I do think the thought process is widely applicable, especially in the final days leading up to round one.
And I think that that's such a good point as well, because I mean, if you think that the market is expansive as we do this Sunday night, very early morning on the East Coast, there's going to be even more things that get popped up every single day. And Ben, what are some of the markets that you are taking a look at that there could be some value on? Because some of the best markets that are out there might not even be available to us right now as we talk about this.
Yeah, definitely. I like when we get, like some of the draft position numbers that continue to come out. I do think like places like DraftKings right now have had a pretty decent helping, but they're ones where they kind of pull out back and forth and they don't necessarily offer them for the full time. So I do like to get some of those, in like the 27 through 30 range. Also, one that we got within the last week on both FanDuel and DraftKings was first round draft props. Some of those guys specifically kind of got hammered into place really quickly. I think if you're looking at a guy like Will McDonald or Emmanuel Forbes, there was a lot of, I would say, noise to the fact that they were going to be selected in the first round. I think they both opened up right around like minus 150, minus 160. If you're looking at some of those numbers now, all the way up to minus 400, minus 320. So I do think some of those multi-way markets, although you probably want to avoid them in any kind of like traditional betting market, I think for the draft specifically, they are kind of in a lot of ways some of the last ones I would say to potentially get updated. So if we do hear some steam, on a certain guy, Quay Walker from last year, I'm going to be immediately looking at that first round draft market and kind of seeing if you can get a plus price money on a guy that for some reason one specific team has kind of identified, and it very much sounds like he's going to be their selection, as we move to the first round. So I'm hoping we get maybe a little bit of that inside information, more than 24 hours before the draft actually commences. So a lot of the places and a lot of the legal books, we can actually hopefully take advantage of some of those opportunities.
And Ben, you bring up something that is so important because most books, they are going to be closing up shop at right around midnight Pacific time. I'm sure that some might be approximately 24 hours before the draft. Others, it's going to be midnight, where the betting is off out here in Las Vegas. And that is something that is so important, Matt, because I take a look at everything, and right now, the best thing that I can advise people for if they're looking at the NFL draft is to just be continuing to refresh Twitter, continuing to be taking a look at articles, mock drafts that come out, because with this being so heavily based on just information and information only, the best way to be able to bet the NFL draft is by being able to pay attention to all sources of news, because you can see something that breaks and within 20 minutes, that number's gone.
Especially in a week like this, Greg, I think of the next few days as a time where medical and character red flags are probably going to start to come out. It seems like every year, the week of the draft, we get 2 or 3 leaks. And I think back to last year, guys like Nakobe Dean and Andrew Booth with medical red flags, or a bit of a character red flag around Matt Corral. I mean, you could almost auto fade guys like this once they get flagged, but you've got to be mindful of, to Ben's point, when your cutoff is going to be to actually place any wagers. And I would tell anybody that if you're not the very first person to get some of this info, it's okay if you don't get the best of the number. It doesn't mean that you've missed out on a bettable number altogether. And that's especially the case in the coming days. To your point, Greg, staying tuned to Twitter or any good information sources. If we get any of these medical or character red flags, those fades are often some of the best bets you can make any time of the year.
Absolutely, and I think that is something that you bring up that is so important. Taking a look at some of these guys that they do have a little bit of an injury past / they have something pop up at the last minute. And Ben, I know that you've been doing a great job of taking a look at all this. Are there any guys that pop up as of right now? And I recognize that a lot of these, they are going to be coming about within the next 24, 48, even 72 hours in terms of guys dealing with injuries, but is there a guy or two that you've identified right now that they could slide in the NFL draft because they have been a little bit banged up?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like complete, I would say, injury-related situation, but it does seem like John Michael Schmitz has very much kind of lost, I would say, his like appeal as the number one center. If you're looking at markets right now, like Joe Tippmann was a guy that it seemed like a lot of insiders thought was going to be the first center off the board. And we kind of seen him greatly move in that direction in some of these first round markets. And I do think there are maybe not necessarily like injury related concerns with John Michael Schmitz, but very much some like, overall like build and how well he's going to hold up at the NFL level. But going back to Matt's point, I do think that those are, some of the best opportunities, because right now, especially this week we are very much kind of, kind of like shifting through the various news sources and information, and you very much kind of have to understand, if a certain guy or a certain media insider has kind of been locked in or understands a team or is closer to a team than a lot of other guys, like maybe you can follow them on that one specific, team type player marriage, but outside of that, like their mock draft might not be worth a whole lot from that particular angle. So I do think that you have to get out there. I know Twitter is a great source, but it does seem like, the books as well are kind of monitoring a lot of these situations. So as soon as it is out on Twitter, the market is going to run, I would say, very quickly. So I do think maybe even gleaning some information from mock drafts as soon as they are kind of released, I think it is probably the best way to, I would say, kind of front run some of these markets coming up here.
And I'll give you a tip as well. Just because a person has a check next to them does not mean that they are a team insider anymore. You could be getting like Flappy Bob or something like that with 20 followers that paid $8 for the check mark, and all of a sudden that is not the information that you do want to be wanting. So do be mindful of that. But I do think that you bring up a good point, Ben, and I'm not sure if you've ever tried this, Matt, but I do think what is interesting is trying to take a look at some of these insiders, and would you be maybe prone to taking a look at some of these guys that maybe followed a player in college and trying to see if they're able to get any information for them, like someone's coming out of Tennessee, like Hendon Hooker, for example, taking a look at like a Tennessee Vols insider to try to see if you're able to get any information there?
I love that angle. I am not personally aware of anything that would be that reliable in a specific scenario like you outlined, because I don't know how close a Tennessee Vols insider could be to a lot of NFL teams. And maybe to your point, they'd be close to a guy like Hendon Hooker and see what he's hearing. But I'm not sure how honest teams are, even with players, unless there's somebody at the very top and they're trying to boost somebody's confidence. There's so much misinformation this time of year that I do try to be pretty vigilant when it comes to all this. I think Daniel Jeremiah's final mock draft, when it comes out on Wednesday, that usually moves things pretty quickly. I think of a guy like Lance Zierlein, ties to Houston. Peter Schrager, I think his relationship with Sean McVay lends some credibility to the Rams, but the Rams kind of don't believe in the first round anymore these days, so don't know what to do there. But I think he's also got some good ties to the Jets. So I do tend to look at specific reporters, but it tends to be more on the NFL level. Maybe, in my opinion, they're just a bit more trustworthy, perhaps a bit more experienced and savvy when it comes to filtering out certain information. And especially in the final days before the draft, when we see final mocks or final updates, it seems like the later we get in these cycles, the more weight a lot of this information should carry from some of the heavy hitters on a more national NFL-based level.
I think that you mentioned a lot of good guys to be able to follow. And hey, I've got something new for when the Rams have a first-round pick in 2047. So we've got that as well. But Matt Landis does a great job with the Props and Ops podcast. Ben Brown does great work over at Pro Football Focus. And coming up next, we've got to talk about C.J. Stroud versus Will Levis to be the number 2 quarterback selected right here on the Greg Peterson Experience on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Ben, I will lead off with you on this one. We've seen a lot of movement with regards to quarterbacks. I mean, it was just a few weeks ago that C.J. Stroud was the odds-on favorite to go number 1 overall. All of a sudden, Will Levis has been picking up some steam. Right now at DraftKings, I'm seeing him at minus 140 to be the number 2 overall pick. C.J. Stroud is all the way down to 4-1 to be going at that number 2 spot. What have you made out of all of this and this team that we have been seeing on Will Levis?
Yeah, I do think it is really interesting. It also seems like we've kind of, in a lot of ways, come full circle, right? I think if you were kind of looking at the draft, maybe even in like early January, kind of post college football national championship, like a lot of people had, Bryce Young as the number 1 overall prospect. I think a lot of people had Will Levis too. And I think, in a lot of ways, ever since then, that was maybe potentially the order, but it has been a lot of, media and everybody else kind of pulling things around. Obviously, shooting Anthony Richardson maybe all the way from just like a fringe first round prospect to very much being in the top 5. It does seem like, that actually does make a lot of sense within NFL circles. And I do think that is going to happen. But the CJ Stroud thing specifically, I think maybe the media in general overvalued what he did against Georgia more than what NFL insiders maybe actually bought into. So I do think, Levis kind of being the prototypical quarterback, getting back to where maybe he was at in early January, I guess does make some sense. But I still think it speaks to a high level of uncertainty with what the Houston Texans are going to do at number 2 overall. And I think if you could accurately predict what they're going to do within this draft, I think you can make a ton of money on a ton of opportunities just based on the fallout that's going to happen with what they actually do at number 2 overall. But I think right now, it seems like they are linked to Will Levis. But, going back to what Matt said previously, this is very much going to be a spot where I think the market is going to react significantly to what Lance Zierlein releases in his final mock draft for the Houston Texans, and whether that is Will Levis or C.J. Stroud or Anthony Richardson. I think that's probably going to be the guy that ends up finishing, as the most likely guy off the board at number 2 when we do actually kind of close that market before the draft, I would say.
And I do think that that's something so good that you mentioned, Ben, because as we know, Lance Zierlein, who does an amazing job of taking a look at the NFL draft, he is based out there in the great state of Texas. And Matt, is that something that you're going to be looking at if you do dive in on this market with Will Levis, whether or not he's going to be the number 2 overall quarterback, number 2 overall pick? Because I think what Ben mentioned there at the back half of it is a big key to all of it.
Yeah, fortunately, I have already dove in. The number's long gone. Hat tip to Fabian Summer, a.k.a. Suma on Gambling Twitter. He was on the Forward Progress podcast and seemingly out of nowhere to me gave a recommendation for Will Levis at 20-1 to go number 2 overall. This was about a week and a half ago, so not all that long ago, but obviously that number long gone. And to me, this illustrates the importance of divorcing maybe your personal opinion from the information that you're getting when we're talking about the NFL draft, because even for a lot of the sharpest bettors in the world, their opinion means very little relative to an NFL game when this all boils down to what NFL GMs, owners, and coaches are going to decide to do. And it's come to light recently that Stroud apparently hasn't interviewed great. The S2 scores, some of that could be way more noise than signal to some people, but it only matters what Houston thinks, and also perhaps C.J. Stroud being a guy that I think we can all agree has the higher floor, but Levis with the higher ceiling. A lot of times in the draft recently, we've seen guys like Josh Allen break through, Justin Herbert, although the Chargers haven't won a playoff game with him, much to my chagrin. We've seen a lot of guys who just have the tools and maybe not the high floor, but teams have been rewarded for shooting for that kind of upside. So it might be a totally different dynamic in terms of how we would handicap these guys on the field looking at something like a point spread. But in this draft betting market, with a lot of the information we're getting, it's tough not to think that there could be some serious legs behind all the Will Levis team that's recently come to light.
And I think that you bring up such a good point as well. The breakthrough that we have been seeing from a lot of these guys like a Josh Allen, you're able to go down the list of these prototypical quarterbacks. And I think that that is something worth taking a look at. And Ben, is that something that you've been diving into as well? Because with the NFL in this day and age, we've obviously noticed that there's not as many running backs being taken in the first round. I think that Bijan Robinson certainly is going to be able to break that mold. We shall see if he's going to be going to, the Philadelphia Eagles or not. That's of intrigue. But how much do you take a look at just recent trends in the NFL, the way that players have been utilized a little bit more, and try to utilize that to try to take a look at something like a over-under in terms of offensive linemen, in terms of the amount of quarterbacks, what have you, that go in the first round?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I do think it is very much a part of my process. I think, what Matt even said in that last part, very much kind of hit home for me personally. Like, it doesn't matter what my evaluation is of Will Levis versus CJ Stroud, right? The only thing that really matters in betting the NFL draft is, what the Houston Texans at this point think of both those guys. But I do think, kind of going back to it, like, my approach and everything else is very much based on the belief that I think that the league in general is moving towards a more efficient equilibrium with how they're actually drafting players and how they're actually focusing on certain positions and how they're actually kind of valuing those positions. So I do think, making bets on teams being maybe sharper or moving more towards an expectation of embracing this like analytically sound approach, I think is very much something that I buy into in my own process. So it is something where I do very much result in kind of fading a guy like Bijan Robinson, who has been getting a lot of steam and very much, is now being talked about like a top 10 player. But for me, I can't necessarily, divorce my beliefs with what I think about the value at the running back position. So I do think there might be one or two teams that very much wants him on board. But I think overall, with the direction in which we're kind of moving from, the league-wide setting of how valuable certain positions are compared to others, like drafting Bijan Robinson even in the first round is just not something I can get on board with. So I can bet some of his overs kind of based on that belief. And maybe I'm not necessarily doing exactly what Matt just said that I probably should be doing, but I still very much think that, mirroring where you actually want to be and then kind of following through with that with your own betting portfolio is the way that you're going to find out, say, long-term or lasting success, betting on these draft props.
Always find your equilibrium. I think that is so important with this. And Matt, I know one thing that you've done a great job of over the years is taking a look at the total amount of players at a specific position that go in the first round, and I know that you've identified a few of these. Last week, you came on, you talked about the quarterbacks. I personally snagged a minus 110 in terms of over 4.5 quarterbacks here at Circa. I'm feeling good about this one, and I know you've got one or two others that you're taking a look at. Take me through what you are taking a look at in terms of the position market.
Sure. And first off, when we're talking about finding your equilibrium, Greg, I know is a fellow beer fan. Equilibrium is a powerhouse brewery on the East Coast, so
yes,
it works in more ways than one for the purposes of this conversation. Now shipping across much of the country, by the way, so check it out if you're curious. But getting back to the task at hand with the draft here, the biggest position group I'm looking at right now, offensive linemen over 5.5, and this one is heavily juiced. I'm seeing minus 425 at DraftKings. That's a high number, but I don't think it's high enough. And there are a lot of guys I respect who have really kept me feeling confident in this bet. Drew Dinsick on the Fifth Year Option podcast made a good case that 6 is probably a very safe floor for this bet. Evan Silva of Established the Run mentioned that from about picks 9 to 17 alone, we could see 4 tackles fly off the board. Anthony Amico, also of Established the Run, said that he views 5 tackles as being basically locks in this case. And then we have several interior offensive linemen who could be very live come late in the first round. And again, if there's one thing I can get across in this conversation, I think it's the importance of looking at maybe missing the best of the number and not forfeiting a bettable number after that point. Yes, this has been steamed, but with more information, I think we can safely have a higher degree of certainty with this bet. And that lends itself to a higher tolerance to lay some vig. If we look at minus 425, break-even probability is 81%. Greg, I think the true probability of this one cashing is closer to the range of 90%, if not even greater than 90%, that we see 6 or more offensive linemen go in round 1.
Yep, and I think that is something that is so important as well. Just because you see a nice big plus price, like a plus 500, if it hits 10% of the time, there's not a lot of value there. Meanwhile, what you just laid out, if you have to hit 81% of the time to break even, you think that that's north of 90% that it is going to. That is very good value. That's all about return on investment, and I think what you laid out there is perfect. And you two gentlemen just did an amazing job of taking a look at the NFL draft. No doubt about it, we're going to be seeing a lot that comes about in the next few days, and we're going to be seeing a lot of player movement, but you two are some of the best at being able to take a look at it. Ben, you do incredible work over at Pro Football Focus, and Matt, you do incredible work over at the Props and Hops podcast. I really do appreciate the time tonight. Thank you so much.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.